The President of the Legislative Council. Good morning. The Council resumes. We continue the motion debate on setting standard working hours. Mr. Chung-kai. Yes, I ask the Secretary for Labour and Welfare to speak. Good morning, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Ms. Chan Yuen-han for moving this motion, and also 5 members, Mr. Lee Cheuk-yan, Ms. Ip Kin-yuen, Ms. Yiu Si-wing, Ms. Chiang Lai-wan, and Mr. Leung Ka-lau for moving the amendments. And the administration fully understands the aspirations of the labour sector in respect of legislating standard working hours to deal with the issue of working hours in Hong Kong. In the previous many debates, the community is divided in respect of how and whether there should be legislation for standard working hours. In April 2013, the administration established the Standard Working Hours Committee to follow up on the Standard Working Hour Policy Report in 2012, so as to promote the understanding among general public towards this complicated issue, and also make recommendations to the administration in respect of dealing with standard working hours, including whether there should be legislation for standard working hours and other alternatives. This is a 24-member committee chaired by Dr. C.H. Leung. Members came from the business sector, the industrial sector, the academic sector, and different sectors of the community, and also all the members of the LAB. The committee is therefore fully representative. The committee worked on 4 related areas, including enhancing public awareness, collecting data on working hours, and working hour systems, promoting public participation, promoting the establishment of a consensus within the community, and conduct discussion according to data available. The committee has done a lot of work, including completing a wide public consultation, listening to the views of employers, employees, labor unions, employers, associations, and other relevant groups, and also the views of the community. And there was also, for the first time, a large-scale household survey on working hours and information in relation to working hour systems. The committee is now further exploring the policy on working hours and also the way forward. Mr. President, I want to point out that the administration attaches high importance to working hours, and yet working hours policy is complicated and controversial and will have a wide implication on employment, markets, manpower situation, labor relations, culture, working culture, business environment, economic development, and competitiveness. The SHWC is actively working on these issues. I hope time and space can be given to the committee so they can fully consider the views of different sectors of the community and the working hour data collected, so that they can focus on a rational and data-based discussion so as to arrive at a consensus. In the first quarter, it is expected that the committee will submit a report to the administration. With these remarks, having heard members' comments, I will give a more detailed reply. Thank you.
Mr. Chung-kai. Thank you, Mr. President. The aim of standard working hours is to set a reasonable number of hours for work to improve the health for employees, as well as allowing them to spend more time with their families. This is part of the family-friendly employment policy. We have had 9 debates in this council. In this regard, in the past term, the Democratic Party supports 44 hours of work per week and paid OT for overtime work. And we're going to support Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion and the amendments. As for Dr. Leung Ka-lau's amendment, although he doesn't mention the 42 hours of work per week, his intention has been expressed in his speech. I don't think he would object to 42 or 44 hours. So we're inclined to support Dr. Leung Ka-lau because he agrees that the government should expeditiously enact legislation. We also support the Labour Party's amendment. As for Dr. Hon Chang's amendment and Mr. Yiu Si-wing's amendment, we have to bear in mind that it is in C.Y. Leung's manifesto that we should have standard working hours. A further delay would only cause the situation to get more serious. So we oppose these amendments. In fact, before C.Y. Leung assumed office, in his election manifesto, he didn't say much about labor policies. There are only two highlights. One is to abolish the offsetting arrangement for MPF contribution. The other is about standard working hours. Now, for MPF contribution offsetting arrangement, we understand that this is not going further. If you ask what C.Y. Leung has done in relation to labor rights, he would say that after thinking about the problem for the question for some time, that he has raised the minimum wage rate, but in fact the policies are set. The policies were set in by his predecessor. So he was just following the established policy, and the labor sector would like the committee to discuss whether how the law should be enacted on standard working hours. But the committee is now working towards the question on whether standard working hours should be set. It seems, according to a survey, that working over 50 hours or 45.3 hours is the norm, but according to labor union surveys, on average, people work for 49 hours per week at least, and for certain sectors, they need to work 50 hours per week, such as the security guards, catering industry, and according to the report of the committee, 23% of the workers, 720,000 workers have to work more than 50 hours per week. Well, of course, for electoral members, we often work over 60 hours per week. But 71% of the workers do not receive OT pay, and the situation is very serious. We recently received a complaint from a member of the public that as the middle rank in the company, he often works overtime, and even after work, he is required to check emails and BlackBerry messages. Now, many employees do not mind being a little bit relaxed on the rules, but they do mind working overtime all the time. And the Standard Working Hours Committee recently suggests that the working hours should be stipulated in a contract agreed between the employer and employee. That is a de facto statement that there should not be standard working hours. It is an impasse. Employers can now put formally into the contract the standard working hours, so to speak. If the contract doesn't expressly provide that you should work overtime, most employees would just work overtime for fear of losing their jobs. They have to support the family and they have to keep their jobs, and in the end they would reluctantly accept this arrangement. So I think if the contract working hours are implemented, then in the end, I think the committee is not doing its job properly. because low-income workers will continue to stay in the same situation. This is contrary to the principle of standard working hours. Now, on enacting legislation on standard working hours, the electoral members had a duty visit in South Korea. Back in 1991, they already implemented standard working hours. Between 2004 to 2011, the number of hours have been reduced to 40, and the South Korea continued to have economic growth, and standard working hours has not imposed a heavy burden on enterprises, and the per capita income has continued to grow. It shows that it doesn't severely impact on businesses. In Taiwan, the standard working hours are 84 hours per 2 weeks, and in Japan, 40 hours, Singapore, 44 per week. In some other countries, 8 hours per day. These are all cities close to Hong Kong, and as a mature economic entity in Asia, we have been doing nothing but continuous discussions. So I hope Secretary for Labour and Welfare would do something. Don't speak for the business sector as the Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development wearing the title of Secretary for Labour and Welfare. You should take the lead in enacting legislation on standard working hours. Mr. Kwok-him. The labour sector has been striving for legislation on standard working hours for many years. Now, the statutory minimum wage legislation was passed 4 years ago, but we still see no direction in legislating on standard working hours. And it was said that C.Y. Leung has not honored his promise in the election manifesto. He set up the Standard Working Hours Committee only for the purpose of dragging things on. I don't think this criticism is fair. Standard working hours have yet to be legislated on because of a deliberate, not because of a deliberate stalling tactic by either the labor or the employer side, but because of the lack of a consensus between the two parties. This will draw a divide in society and cause a wider divide between the labor sector and employers and employers. And Mr. Tommy Cheung once pointed out that standard working hours would mean the end for them. He even said that standard working hours policy would be topping the list of the most undesirable policies. Well, earlier on, a consensus was reached, and I think this is a breakthrough. It shows that the stance of employers have changed on legislating on standard working hours. However, it is the view of the Standard Working Hours Committee that the standard working hours should be stipulated in contracts between in employment contracts, and the labor sector criticizes strongly this recommendation. The greatest divide between employers and employees is not whether to legislate on standard working hours, but on how. It is impossible to stipulate standard working hours across the board because of the diversity of job nature. But the labor sector believes that only by taking a broad brush approach would labor rights be protected, and they propose 44 hours per week. In fact, in many sectors, they already have the policy of working 5.5 days per week, or 44 hours per week. This is, well, for those that goes beyond 44 hours, is because of the job nature, such as firemen, journalists, those in the catering industry, and those in the television and film industry. How could you ask the practitioners in these sectors to work standard working hours? We need a rational discussion. Some say that standard working hours will not cause the loss of flexibility in terms of work arrangement in these sectors. However, we should discuss this. If we take a broad brush approach in setting standard working hours, whilst at the same time we allow exemptions, will this be the best practice? In Japan, the standard working hours is set at 40 hours per week. But for managers and supervisors, they are exempted. So in the end, in Japan, there are many managers in name. It shows that setting standard working hours with exemptions may not be the best way forward. The SWHC believes that a broad brush approach is not feasible, but it doesn't rule out the possibility of setting standard working hours for certain sectors. The community, employers, and employees should hold a reasonable or rational discussion on this issue. Should standard working hours be set on the basis of the sector, on the job nature, or on income? Earlier, labor representatives in the opposition camp staged a protest in a dinner banquet attended by the Secretary for Labor and Welfare and other officials, and they put up a slogan of striving for genuine standard working hours. They also accused Standing Ng of selling out workers. This is obviously political grandstanding, and they're trying to earn political mileage. What is meant by genuine standard working hours or not genuine standard working hours? This is a labor issue. This year we have the DC election, and next year we're going to have the LegCo election, and the labor issue has become politicized. It has become a topic under attack by the opposition camp, such that there is now little room for rational discussion. The DAB believes that the issue is a complex one. We need rational discussion among the three parties so that a consensus can be reached for smooth and feasible implementation of the policy. I support Dr. An Chang's amendment.
Mr. Andrew Leung, President, Hong Kong's success rely on flexibility and free economy. According to the Heritage Foundation's Freedom Index, we get a score of 96.8 points, and we have been on the top for many years. According to 10 indicators, business freedom, trade freedom, we are always on the top. We have been criticized as the freest economy for many years because we have a mature market, but this year's score is lower than that of last year's. The BPA has pointed out repeatedly that in recent years the government has resorted to administrative control measures, from the legislation on the minimum wage rate and also the anti-speculation measures in the property market. These measures fail to achieve the objectives, and it also affects the stability of our policy making. And therefore our business environment has been affected. Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion is advocating a policy that will affect our business overall and our economy as well, and not just the employers. The government should lead this community to discuss the pros and cons, consult widely among the business sector, and also to take a clear look at productivity and also the flexibility to be enjoyed by businesses. We should not be imposed of anything before we have that discussion. We have reservation in the BPA about legislation on standard working hours. We have to stress that this would undermine flexibility and freedom of businesses, and this would also erode our business efficiency. So we urge the government to have regard to the overall interest and come up with proper measures. Let me say something about the negative impacts of standard working hours. Like other economies, Hong Kong is facing an aging population and a shortage of labor force. Our unemployment rate has been very low. It's almost full employment. Many enterprises have complained about difficulties in recruitment, especially in security services, catering, and so on and so forth. There are more job vacancies than applicants. So if we introduce standard working hours, manpower planning of businesses will be affected. It will also affect the outsourcing of manpower contracts. And SMEs will face a higher compliance cost. And the cost will be passed on to the general public. With the introduction of minimum wage, management fees have increased, and the lunch box has cost us more nowadays. According to the 2012 report on standard working hours, if we set the number at 44 per hours, and then the overtime pay to be 1 to 1.5 times the normal rate, then annually employers will have to incur an additional cost of 8 billion to 55 billion. I think if we apply this to the present day rates, it will be even higher. To many businesses, standard working hours are not a strange concept. Many companies and enterprises would regard our flexible working hours as advantage. Once we introduce this standard working hour system, it would affect our competitive edge. The community should not ignore the difficulties in implementing this and the possibility of more labor disputes. There are many sectors with special characteristics. We have many different jobs, and their nature is different. Legislation should be enacted in light of local situations. The UK was the last in the EU to have this because of and they did it because of political pressure. They set a maximum working hours. So it's 48 hours, but the employer and employee can agree to exceed that. We want to have innovation and creative industry. For those who rely on their creativity to earn a living, just adhering to a standard working hour system is very difficult and it's not sustainable. It's difficult to get a consensus. And it will also cause the labor relationship to be strained. And some enterprises may have to shorten its business hours or operating hours or hire a bigger staff team, and that would affect morale and also its business viability. We are now in the automation era. Many jobs will be replaced by automation. For example, the airport authority that would install machines to take the place of porters. And even though those jobs require intelligence, for example, AFP has engaged an automated writing machine producing 30,000 articles per quarter. Well, the employer and the employee are not in a conflict under such a situation. We should work together to increase the business environment and create more job opportunities. The Hong Kong FI and the BPA has come up with a preliminary suggestions, and that is all the standard working hours and the relevant breaks and rest days should be set out in contract. This is suggested by the committee. We agreed. We have reservation about enacting legislation to regulate standard working hours. Mr. Wong Kwok-hing, well, I rise to speak in support of Ms. Chan Yuen-han's original motion and urge the government to enact legislation on this expeditiously. I find it very regrettable with Mr. Andrew Leung's speech. Mr. Leung is asking the government to shelve the plan on legislation. He has exaggerated the adverse impacts of legislation on standard working hours. Those allegations are not true. So he represents not the enlightened employers in the community, but rather he holds outdated views. Our stability and prosperity is based on the fact that we have a enlightened community, and we should not rely on our labor and sweatshops for prosperity and stability. So I can not agree with Mr. Andrew Leung, and I have to show my dissatisfaction with his remarks. Now let me talk about my personal experience, and I want to illustrate that it's important that we have legislation, and we must have legislation. In 2012, I helped the tram company union and tram drivers to have a compensation of lunch hour, and that 1 hour will be compensated by 1.5 times the normal rate. After World War II, we have been striving for improvement to labor welfare, including the pay and working hours. The tram company and the employees of tram company have been in a sort of a game. In the 40s, the system of overtime pay was introduced. Workers worked 8 hours, and very usually that they would have to work 2 additional hours. And for the overtime work, the compensation was 1.5 times the normal rate. You may ask why? Well, it was a custom that started from that era. And then it continued until 2003. What happened in 2003? We had the SARS epidemic affecting our economy, and we were dealt a severe blow. There was a recession, and the employer, I have this comic strip with me. The boss, instead of trying to find means to tie over the difficulties, it tried to target its employees, and they came up with this trick. No change to existing workforce, but for new entrants, new recruits, they will only get that 1.5 times OT rate after 10 years. Or else you would only get 1.25, the normal rate, if your service is under 10 years. As I've said, well, it would only start after 10 years. So they would choose people around the age of 50. They recruit people around the age of 50. So you are recruited when you are 50, but the retirement age is 60. In other words, if you join the tram company in 2003, and after 10 years, you retire, and you never get the 1.5 overtime rate. So the drivers have different benefits, different overtime rate. So I helped the union to have a negotiation with the tramway company. At first, we were ignored. And in October 2012, we helped the drivers to stage an industrial action. Some 60 of us marched to the company, insisting that if the tramway company would not be moved, we would stage even more industrial actions. And the tramway company then agreed to discuss with the employees. And I have to compliment the tram company for agreeing to resume the 1.5 normal rate for overtime work. For decades, FTU has been adhering to the same position. We have been consistent. We are not just asking for this now. We need to have legislation on standard working hours, because if we don't have this, new recruits, new entrants do not have the bargaining power to get this. And even if your contract states that you have this condition in the employment contract, well, you cannot rely on legislation, a piece of legislation to protect you. And during hard times, this will be taken away. We must have legislation. Then it's compulsory and enforceable. Therefore, we would like the 24-member committee to work very, very hard, and within the current term of government, come up with some results. Secretary, I support you. Keep it up. President, minimum wage and standard working hours are just like twins. We cannot have one but not the other.
Mr. Leung Yiu-chung. Mr. President, with regard to standard working hours, the labor sector has been fighting for it over the years, and the issue has been discussed in this council many times before. It's a pity that up to today there has been no progress. To the wage earners, it is really disappointing. During the British Hong Kong government, Hong Kong was under the influence of the business sector, and they ignored the interests of the working class. A government which was led by the business sector, of course, would not care about the livelihood of the workers. After reunification, people have had high hopes. Behind the SARG is the central government, who claims to be working in the interests of the working class. Yet, the SARG does not protect the workers. After reunification, the government claimed to be working for the interests of the working class and designated May Day as a paid holiday. Workers have got one more day off and have the status enhanced. Yet, after making the 1st of May, Labor Day, a public holiday, the government, the SARG, has never considered the spirit of Labor Day. Yesterday, Mr. Lee Cheuk-yan spoke on the meaning of Labor Day, and it is related to standard working hours. In 1886, the 1st of May, 300,000 workers in Chicago had a demonstration. They asked for improvement to working conditions. They asked for 8-hour working day. But on this, the police opened fire and killed 4 workers, and also 4 workers were arrested, and they were convicted, and they were hanged. To commemorate this day, in July 1889, at the international conference, it was decided that International Labor Day was to be the 1st of May to commemorate this date. In 1935, the United States legislated to establish an 8-hour working day. Now, the labor sector find it regrettable that the SARG only chose on the 1st of May, but it has never promoted the background of this Labor Day, and it has never done anything to uphold the spirit of Labor Day, which is an 8-hour working day. Why are they so scary about it? They don't want to step on the toes of the business sector. They find it difficult to give an account to the labor sector. Therefore, over so many years, the SARG has never explained why there is a need to celebrate the Labor Day and why the Labor Day should become a public holiday. Mr. President, the administration is just the same as the SWHC. It said that it supported 3 principles legislation to regulate working hours, to regulate contracts so that it can specify working hours, and also to protect the underprivileged workers who work long hours on a low wage. It sounds good, but the administration will only work on contract or contracted working hours. If they have done the first bit, then the second and the third bit can be solved easily. Now they put emphasis on the second and third points. They just want to pave the way for not legislating for standard working hours. They want to appear good, but they are just paying lip service to setting of standard working hours. The SARG does not learn lessons. It doesn't protect the interests of workers. When we discussed the setting of standard minimum wage, there were people opposed. There were members opposing standard wages. Say, for example, Mr. Yiu Si-wing said that with standard working hours, costs will be increased. Flexibility reduced. There would be reduced in demand, increased in unemployment rate. With standard working hours, there will be inflation and rising prices. It seems that the world will collapse. Yet, we have standard minimum, statutory minimum wage. Has Hong Kong collapsed? The arguments against minimum wage, such as increasing unemployment, undermining competitiveness, they don't come true. Unemployment rate is next to nil. These arguments do not hold any water. If the government is sincere and determined to establish standard working hours, and these are they are not problems at all. Mr. President, with regard to standard working hours, it will be a long-standing issue. We will continue to discuss it this year, next year, and the year after next. Without a democratic government which is accountable to the people, the SARG will not work in the interest of the community at large. The debate will go on. Mr. Felix Chung. The labor sector representatives fighting for the interests of the labor force is reasonable, but they should not smear the labor relationship in Hong Kong. In fact, labor relationship in Hong Kong is very harmonious. There are, look at the number of labor disputes in Hong Kong. Recently, there was one with the Cathay Pacific. But if you look at SMEs, the SMEs employ a dozen or so employees, and there is close communication and discussion between employers and employees. Labor relationship is not so bad as what is described by some members. Many labor sector representatives raise the issue of standard working hours, and one important argument is family-friendly policy. Long working hours will take away the time to be spent with family members. It will take away the time to study, to further study, or to rest. But the answer is that you give them overtime pay, they will continue to work. If they continue to work, how can they how can they conduct further study? How can they spend time with the families? If you want to be family friendly, then you should set the maximum working hours, say 45 hours. Then if you set it at 45 hours, then after you have worked 45 hours a week, then you have to quit. You have to get off work. Instead of just giving overtime pay, if money can buy a family-friendly policy, that shouldn't be the case. Fortunately, we have a very low unemployment rate. It's maintained about 3.3% because of a low unemployment rate when the standard minimum wage is set at $32.5. Not too many SMEs or not too many businesses are just paying the standard minimum wage. They pay much more. It's a matter of demand and supply in the labor market. Market forces will determine the pay. If I pay $32.5 an hour, I really can't get an employee. If I just say that you work 60 hours per week, there is no overtime pay. Will you get an employee? Of course you can't, because they have alternatives. They don't need to work for you. They have other opportunities. Now that's the situation in Hong Kong. Now some labor sector representatives say that exemptions can be given to certain trades and industries. Some say that those who make $25,000 or $20,000 will be exempted, or more will be exempted, and then those who make less than that will be given overtime pay. Well, if that's the case, then those who are making $25,000 of $20,000 a month or more will not be benefited by any family-friendly policy. Now, for the IT, for the financial services, for the accountants, they don't want their working hours to be restricted. Hong Kong's success is based on flexibility, say those in the financial sector. If they have good performance, then at the end of the year, they may get an additional pay of 12 months salary or 24 months of salary. So if you set maximum working hours or standard working hours, they will not be happy. Recently, the Standard Working Hours Committee, chaired by Dr. C.H. Leung, made a proposal with regard to contracted working hours. The contracted working hours should be made according to the circumstances of the trade or the industry. In the contract, it is spelled out how many hours of work and whether overtime pay will be remunerated or not. That is the most realistic approach. The Liberal Party has been promoting contracted working hours. And pay should be adjusted according, pay should be made according to the capacity of the businesses, and that will be in the interest of the community at large. Take the example of the tramways quoted by Mr. Wong Kwok-hing. At the end of the day, they sat down and talked and agreed. There was no large-scale confrontation. They adopted a strike to force the employer to compromise. At the end of the day, they sat down and talked. Contracted working hours is the most realistic approach. The Liberal Party position says, with regard to Ms. Chan Yuen-han's amendment and all the with regard to Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion and the rest of the amendments, they ask for standard working hours of 44 hours, and we do not support that.
Mr. Siu-ping. Mr. President, Standard Working Hours Committee underwent a year's discussion, and finally a consensus has been reached. And the labor sector supports this consensus, which has come by a little bit late. However, we don't see a legislative framework yet, and the labor sector will continue to strive for standard working hours legislation. Working hour situation in Hong Kong has long been criticized. According to a report on a survey conducted in 2014, those working in the supermarket and retail outlets and the security guard industry work for more than 50 hours per week. For Chinese restaurant workers, they work for 60 hours per week. And some labor union representatives earlier pointed out a lot of problems caused by long working hours. Over 70% of kitchen workers and chefs suffer physical injury as a result of long working hours, and some also experience family problems. The government always advocates industrial safety and family-friendly employment policies, but the lack of standard working hours legislation is actually a contrast to these policies. Well, back in the 60s or 70s, workers used to enjoy overtime compensation. During public holidays, when workers were required to work, they get double the normal pay. This is only reasonable if you require workers to work on their days off. However, the labor market atmosphere is different now. We do not often see overtime compensation for workers. And according to the consultant report for the SWHC, close to 60% of workers in the poll had worked overtime in the past 7 days. Neither do they get overtime pay nor any pay. Standard working hours only aims at protecting labor rights. The business sector opposes standard working hours legislation, adopting the same reasons that for legislating on statutory minimum wage back then. Some business representatives, even representatives in this council, say that standard working hours would cause people to lose jobs and cause the economy to be negatively affected. But after implementation of statutory minimum wage, in fact, our economy boomed even further, and we are close to full employment. And the panel on manpower in 2011 organized a duty visit to South Korea to learn about standard working hours. In South Korea, when the first phase standard working hours was implemented, the GDP increased from $2.1 trillion to $2.9 trillion, up by 39%. So it shows that minimum wage rates would not undermine economic growth. Recently, there have been suggestions that lines should be drawn at income levels of $10,000, $12,000, and $15,000 in setting standard working hours to minimize the impact on employers and employees, and this, or as a means of impact assessment. This problem of long working hours not only affect the health and family life of workers earning $15,000 below. If the government takes this approach, then I'm very concerned for workers earning $15,000 or below. The minimum wage will be adjusted downward, and even in the future, if the government legislates on standard working hours, the problem of long working hours for employees in general will still remain. I think the threshold should be increased to $17,000, $20,000, and $25,000, so that we can understand the full impact of standard working hours. This will be conducive to setting the scope. And the FLU that I represent suggests that the standard working hours should be set at 44 hours per week, and overtime compensation should be calculated in the ratio of 1 to 1.5. I support the legislation on standard working hours. I so submit, Mr. President. Mr. Leung-sing. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, on this labor issue, we have had many discussions in the past. A few years ago, the statutory minimum wage legislation was completed. And on this topic of legislating on standard working hours, we should understand the differences between the two issues. The labor sector is striving for standard working hours. In mid-March, the report on standard working hours was released, and it became a hot topic on Mother's Day and on Labor Day, and we also saw survey after survey with data released. All these show that there are pros and cons to standard working hours. It would also help workers gain work-life balance and improve their physical health, and that there should be reasonable compensation for overtime pay. These are the pros. On the other hand, we should also look at the impact on enterprises, how their flexibility would be affected, how the cost of operation would increase, and how it will cause inflation to go up. All these, in the long term, would undermine the competitiveness and economic growth in Hong Kong. And there are sayings that enterprises in Hong Kong are mostly SMEs or micro enterprises, and they experience different difficulties in their operations. On the 18th of March, the SWH committee released a report showing that preliminary consensus has been reached after 2 years of discussion. Instead of taking a broad brush approach on standard working hours across all sectors, the recommendation is that the standard working hours and overtime pay should be clearly stipulated in contracts, and this recommendation then sparked rounds of discussion. This recommendation is a great departure from the suggestions from labor unions, and some labor unions heavily criticized this recommendation. According to a survey, conducted based on the initial consensus. 60% of respondents were for standard working hours. Only 10.4% of respondents opposed standard working hours. About 21.4% find that there is no need to set standard working hours, and some say that there should be flexible arrangement, and some 33% agrees that a broad brush approach can be taken, and some 13.2% says that neither could work. So there are divergent views according to the survey. It shows that standard working hours should not be set mandatorily across the board and across sectors. The norm is 8 hours per day. This is the general standard, but in different countries, in light of their own pace of development and economic development, they sometimes work for 5 days, 6 days, or even 7 days a week, and some work for 40, 44, 48 hours per week. It's impossible to find an international standard. So if we are to set standard working hours in Hong Kong, it is quite impossible to set it across the board, because different jobs, different ranks may require different working hours. Say in the catering industry, they may have off-duty hours, and for teachers, they may need to work overtime to check assignments, to carry out extracurricular activities. So there are different working hours arrangement for different sectors. And the majority of SMEs and microenterprises operation will be undermined because of increased costs, and we need to strike a balance. In setting standard working hours, we need to consider the actual circumstances. We should avoid a broad brush approach. We should start with the easier sectors. Setting standard working hours may not be easy, Mr. President. Yet we still need to find our way forward, because this is the global trend. So the Standard Working Hours Committee has spent 2 years in researching into the issue and reaching a consensus. Now there is an initial consensus and recommendation, which is based on the local circumstances. It is reasonable, it is feasible, sustainable. I think in setting the standard working hours for certain sectors, we may start with giving exemptions to certain industries with a lesser degree of flexibility, so that legislating on standard working hours and providing exemption can go hand in hand. I personally think that we should set a timetable for legislating on standard working hours, and then we can give priorities to sectors, different jobs and different ranks of the same job in formulating the relevant policy and the regulatory regime. This is a major change. We need to do it gradually and in an orderly manner, and there should be a consensus.
Mr. Jeffrey Lam, thank you, President. Long working hours can be hard. How hard can it be? I think all members here have deep feelings about this. In recent years, we have filibusters here, and things have been dragging on. Members, officials over there, and our secretariat staff have been subject to one detention after another. Yes, we need work-life balance. But this problem should be the subject of negotiation and discussion between the employer and the employee. We should not talk about regulations lightly. Well, our economy has been doing better, somewhat better than other neighbors. But now the global economy has not yet recovered, affecting our economy and our exports. Many SMEs are still not doing well. We have been enjoying business freedom. We were able to make adjustments in a flexible manner. In recent years, there are more and more constraints. Business freedom has been narrowed by different rules and regulations. Flexibility is no longer there, adding to the pressure faced by SMEs. President, we know the different trades have different modes of operation. It's difficult to talk about them in the same breath. If we regulate working hours, there will be problems. We have labor-intensive trades, and we also have trades that involve seasonal work. You will be very busy at some of the time, and at some other time, it's so void of activities that you can take a rest. And also, working hours cannot be clearly defined. Some people work from home. Somebody work on a project base. You have to meet the deadline as long as you have completed the project and deliver the outcome is okay. And also, the work has become fragmented. We have more casual workers, part-time workers. And the new generation of youth would work for a few months and then take a few months of vacation after that. The structural change in the labor market has prompted the business sector to explore new means to make the job flexible. For example, we have seen the introduction of family-friendly policy and to attract female employees. It's not meaningful in such a context to try to calculate standard working hours. I have received many complaints from people in the business sector saying that regulation of working hours would affect labor relationship and work culture. For example, most employers value the efficiency and performance of their employees. And sometimes working hours can be handled flexibly. In the morning, the employee may come in and have breakfast, and at 3:30 p.m. the employee can have an afternoon break. And also when it's the birthday of an employee, the people can cut a birthday cake and celebrate in the office. But if you regulate working hours, then you have to make sure that every minute is worked. And you have to follow all the rules. And during office hours, you are supposed to do work only. And even if you return late from lunch, the employer would have to calculate the time of a late arrival. I don't think employers want to do this. And if after a duty trip that the employee may want to stay behind for a few days to visit relatives, how can you account for all these flexible arrangements? And it's difficult to set a standard system, because if everyone has to work the same number of hours, the employer would always recruit the most efficient ones. Once we have legislation on working hours, we cannot go back. The number would go down. It would be shorter and shorter. Of course, we treasure work-life balance, but we should also respect business freedom and flexibility. We should allow the employer and the employee to negotiate freely. The unemployment rate is just 3.2%. The competition is keen in the market. Enterprises must offer attractive conditions of employment to recruit new employees and to retain existing employees. If business is good, I believe most employers would try to make their employees happy through different means. But if business is difficult, and if you have something introduced to add to the burden, then the only way out is to close the business. In a free society, we must allow flexibility. We cannot regulate everything. I hope everyone should be prudent. We should not do bad things out of good intention. Mr. Frankie Yik, in the past 3 years, the SAR government has responded to the long working hours affecting the employees' family life, conduct studies on working hours. But there's no consensus in the community. So setting standard working hours can be very complicated, and the implications can be far-reaching. Business environment in Hong Kong is more and more difficult. We are seeing costs going up and up. Since the introduction of minimum wage in May 2011, there's been the ripple effect leading to escalating wages, and SMEs have been hard hit. Since the economic prospect is unclear, if we have standard working hours introduced, that would add to the already heavy burden. Enterprises will be subject to too many restraints, and their business sentiment will be affected. This is not conducive to our economic development. After the introduction of minimum wage, apart from increasing the wage levels, there's a reshuffle in the workforce. For example, in my industry, logistics, there's a problem of labor shortage. Unemployment rate is 3.2%. That means full employment. Recruitment is very difficult. Although the Liberal Party and the logistic industry have urged the government to allow labor importation to relieve the short to medium-term labor shortage, the government will not budge. And there's no proposed solution on manpower shortage from the government. Some enterprises will have to extend the working hours of their existing employees because there's no choice. This problem arises from labor shortage. Before we resolve labor shortage problems and we go for legislation on standard working hours, it will not help solve the problem of long working hours. And then enterprises would have to recruit more people to sustain their operations, leading to more problems of labor shortage. There are different trades which cannot really comply with the standard working hours requirement. For example, according to the suggestion of the committee, that the working hours and the overtime pay rates should be set in the contract. This will affect many SMEs in the logistics industry. For example, for drivers driving cross-boundary vehicles, goods are shipped through land transport to Hong Kong. Delays can happen from time to time in the loading, in the boundary clearance and operations, and sometimes there are traffic jams which cannot be foreseen, and the drivers will sometimes have to work for long hours. If there is inclement weather, the overtime work by drivers will be even more serious. In our airport, in our container terminals, they are in operation around the clock. Under the globalization of business situations, it's unavoidable that we have to extend working hours to provide quality service. If we have legislation on standard working hours and we have requirements on overtime payment, and we do not allow time off renewal or other means of compensations, this would add to the cost. And the industry will not be able to pass on the cost to the customers because of competition. Many will have no choice but to close. with escalating labor costs. And in order to reduce the recurring costs of labor, many enterprises would increase or downsize the workforce, and many enterprises will employ more part-time workers. If we have legislation on standard working hours, the employment pattern in the industry will change. The logistic industry will need flexibility. So apart from hiring part-time drivers, the drivers will be turned to self-employed people, and they will be remunerated on the mileage basis. According to other countries with standard working hours, this is not a solution, not a panacea for solving problems with long working hours. Actually, the introduction of standard working hours would have profound impact on the business environment. The Liberal Party, as a party representing the business sector, we agree that there should be work-life balance. According to the CNS department, in its 2014 report on working hours, in 2014, for full-time employees in Hong Kong, the median number of working hours per week is 45.3. It's very close to the proposed 44 hours under standard working hours. We believe the employers and employees can come up with an agreement on compensation for overtime work in the light of the actual situation. If we have a across-the-board system for standard working hours and also overtime payment rate, it would stir up conflicts between the employer and the employee, and the confrontation would be more serious, and we end up losing more than what we try to achieve in benefits. Mr. Wong Kwok-hing referred to the tramway company case. Mr. Wong was involved, and I was at the time responsible for managing the workforce in the tramway company. Well, all policy back then were negotiated with the result of negotiation with the tram drivers. If they did not agree, the industrial action would immediately come to pass. At that time, the economy was in the doldrums, and we discussed the matter with the drivers, and we implemented the agreed arrangements. That's the fact.
Kenneth Leung. A recent global human resource report pointed out that 22% of working population work more than 48 hours per week. In a 2011 survey, Hong Kong's full-time workers worked on average 49 hours per week. Apparently, in places where standard working hours are set at 44 hours, then Hong Kong people work long hours, and that's a serious situation. In my accountancy profession, long working hours has all along been criticized. Mr. President, because of this, my ward office asked the CUHK to conduct a survey in 2014 among the accountants and survey their views on legislating on standard working hours. The study was divided into 3 parts. The first part was to interview the employers in the accountancy profession. The second part was to have focused discussion with the employees. And then the third part was to conduct an internet survey on the professional consultants of the major professional accountant associations. Whether it's a focus group discussion of employees or internet survey, the respondents were of the view that in the accountancy profession there was a culture of long working hours. The employers and the employees were of the view that long working hours was a structural issue. They had to meet the deadlines. They had to meet the requirements of the clients. The employees oppose legislation on the basis of personal decision and culture and work culture. Employers and employees I'm talking about legislating standard working hours, legislation on working hours. Employers and employees had different views on legislating on working hours. The employees, the majority of the employees support legislating to regulate working hours. But on a practical point, legislating to regulate legislation on working hours in the accountancy profession and in other professions will be very difficult. The reasons have been given by many members. Our profession has to meet the requirements of the law and our clients. Some professionals are willing to work 14 or 15 hours per day. They are willing to work for that in order to meet the professional requirement. If there is legislation on working hours, that will not be appropriate. Engineers, lawyers, doctors, and of course our profession have the same problem. If there is an across-the-board legislation on standard working hours, that will not be appropriate. We can make reference to Singapore. In Singapore, Mr. President, the Employment Act has a provision to regulate working hours. If an employee has a monthly pay of 4,500 Singaporean dollars, then it will be subject to regulation 8 hours per day and no more than 44 hours per week. But there are exceptions. If the employee voluntarily work overtime, that's also permitted. The overtime should not be more than 12 hours per day or altogether or 72 hours per week. Or per month, rather. Now, that is in respect of overtime. That is a kind of protection to workers, in particular, who need to rely on a lot of physical work. The regulation does not cause any substantial increase in labor costs. Recently, the SWHC has proposed a compulsory contractual clause on working hours. Should it be standard working hours, or should that be a contractual working hour clause? The two approaches can be considered. Different industries and trades have their own needs. Some accountants do not resist working overtime. Our employers will, of course, care for these employees. Many employers do provide overtime pay, overtime holidays, flexi working hours. Employees can take a 2-month paid or unpaid leave so that they can balance their work and family life. With regard to legislation on standard working hours, I have an open mind and I do not see the need to adopt an across-the-board approach of legislating on standard working hours. Thank you. Mr. Lam Tai-fai. Thank you, Mr. President. Setting standard working hours is a complicated issue. It's more complicated than minimum wage. Before there is any consensus between employers and employees, the government has to be careful. It has to consider the overall picture. If the time, the conditions are not appropriate, the administration should not rush into legislation. Hong Kong is a civilized society. We need to respect the workers. We also need to consider the business environment and Hong Kong's overall competitiveness. The government should not just be one-sided. It shouldn't be hasty. It should not just want to honor the promise of the CE and rush into legislation. Labor relation is a very important issue. We need to employers, employees rely on each other. The labor policy should be balanced. It should not be inclined towards one side and cast a division between employers and employees, thereby undermining labor relation. The business sector is very concerned that the government will introduce an across-the-board legislation that will undermine flexibility of labor market that goes against the principles of free market. In view of uncertainty in the global market, Hong Kong's economy is facing a downward pressure. There is rising costs, rising rent, and rising labor costs. The business sector cannot bear with this. If there is the introduction of standard working hours together with statutory minimum wage, many SMEs will have to follow up. There will be a wave of closing down. The economy of Hong Kong will be seriously affected. The government has to be very careful in considering the pros and cons of standard working hours. If there is legislation for standard working hours, then the employers will have to pass the cost to the consumers. That will increase prices, increase inflation, take away the purchasing power of the low-income earners. The government will find it difficult to manage this place. There will be a domino effect. Business environment will be very bad. It will undermine competitiveness of Hong Kong and deter investors. That will affect our economy and people's job opportunities. The business sector, therefore, proposes that the administration should look into the trades and industries which have long working hours. The administration should not have a piece of legislation that covers all industries and trades. It is understandable that those from the labor constituencies support standard working hours, but they have to consider adverse impacts of legislation which will undermine the interests of workers. Businesses in dealing with standard working hours may have to break up their jobs and employ casual workers and employ part-time workers in order to deal with rising costs. Many low-skilled workers have to work long hours without rest, and that affects their health and also their family life. The labor sector therefore proposes to implement standard working hours to remunerate overtime pay. I've also heard that it's proposed to set up trades committees and set up standard working hours for different trades according to the circumstances. That will address the concerns of the employers and employees. Legislation on standard working hours should not proceed with haste. According to statutory minimum wage, according to law, standard minimum wage has to be reviewed once every 2 years. In the past few years, standard minimum wage has been raised from $28 to $30 and then $32.5 last month. Representatives of the business sector are concerned that minimum wage is reviewed once every 2 years, and that is only an upward trend. Our worry has come true. Minimum wage has been rising. Employers really cannot afford that. The negative impacts of minimum wage have increased. There is competing for workers in different industries. Say, for example, the catering industry, there is competition for workers. Because of shortage of manpower, they have to reduce their business hours, and some even have to follow up their business. These are real-life examples. Mr. President, employers and employees can negotiate their contract conditions. They can negotiate on working hours and on overtime remuneration. If they can be sincere in coming to an agreement, there is no need to legislate. There will be flexibility. That will be good for everybody. If employees are not happy with the terms, they can negotiate with their employers. If the terms are not attractive, if the terms are unfair, then the business will not be able to get any employees. In a free market, there is the adjustment according to market forces. Mr. President, legislation on standard working hours has to be dealt with carefully. Labor relationship is very important. Employers, employees should be treated fairly and equally. There is a need to consider data and objectively instead of just trying to honor the promise of the CE. That will cause unnecessary, if they proceed this way, that will cause unnecessary disputes.
Mr. Wong Yuk-man. Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Chan Yuen-han from FTU moves a motion to debate on legislation on standard working hours. This is just the right timing. In March, the SWH committee released a report with recommendations that the overtime pay and the stacking working hours and whether there should be paid meal breaks should be stipulated in employment contracts, and that further discussion should be held on whether there should be legislation on standard working hours, and we should not rush things through. And on these recommendations, we see the so-called standard working hours under the Communist Party's rule. That is, they are favoring the business sector and ignoring the demand of the labor sector. I recall standing in the standard committee member of the FTU said that made some remarks, and then Ms. Chan Yuen-han that then criticized him for his inexperience for making such a remark. Now, we have long working hours in Hong Kong. The Swiss Bank in 2012 released a report on income structure and working hours. And we work 2,296 hours per year, far exceeding the 1,500 hours per capita working hour per annum. And we rank number 5 on the list. And this has to do with the government's arbitrary approach to take on economic development and depriving the rights of low-income earners. Even the white-collar class is required to sacrifice their health and family life. It's really sad. Why should we continue to accept the working conditions like a third world country? The business sector always like to talk about the downside of standard working hours like they did for statutory minimum wage. They said that this will undermine their competitiveness. They do so because this can undermine the bargaining power of workers. And Matthew Cheung, how dare you for setting the rate at $32.5? Why not 50 cents more? That shows your mindset. The SMW Commission is really outrageous for setting the rate at $32.5, not even 50% more. All the talk about undermining competitiveness, impacting on economic growth. Well, do some soul-searching, Secretary. After implementing SMW, has our business environment been undermined? Has our unemployment rate gone up? has our economic growth slackened? Well, it has to do with other factors instead of the statutory minimum wage rate. How about high rentals? Now, the mainland is lowering the customs for some goods, and then our retail business is affected. And you just ignore all these other factors and focus on the labor sector. It's really outrageous. Well, just like the RCHE incident, whenever I see you, I get very angry. And now you say that the voucher scheme will be suspended for this RCHE. And we know at the very beginning that this can't work. For the private residential care homes for elderly, this is the hell for elderly residents. Well, you should stay home and die rather than living in such a home. In July 2011, I went on a duty visit organized by the Panel on Manpower of this Council to South Korea. We found that in terms of purchasing power, after implementing standard working hours of 40 hours per week in 2004, the per capita purchasing power increased from $2.1363 trillion to $2.9 trillion US dollars. And after cutting down working hours, the income of workers has increased significantly. So some right-wing economists, that's the philosophy of some right-wing economists. Now, if the argument of the business sector hold water, then for those countries with standard working hours, their economies would collapse. So, Secretary, your role should be the intermediary or the referee among parties to formulate policies that can strike a balance and to prevent confrontation between parties. However, the government, in terms of labor issues, is trying to fool the public. And recently, the government states that it will oppose the threshold being set at $15,000 a month because this will undermine the interests of general employees. But this is outrageous because for employees working long hours, their health would definitely be affected. Should we increase expenditure on public health? 44 hours per week, this is just a minimum, a humble request. Well, Hong Kong only focuses on development and exploits workers, and we just ignore our living standard. Last year we had a Cantonese popular song, and this is about protecting labor rights and gaining work-life balance for workers to spend more time with their families and to live again. And I support the setting standard working hours at 44 hours per week. I support Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion. I so submit. Mr. Chung Kwok-chi. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the issue of standard working hours has been discussed in Hong Kong for many years, and more than once I had debated on legislation on standard working hours, and in October 2012, I moved a motion on legislating on standard working hours. 2 years on, it seems that there is still no proposal on legislating on standard working hours and overtime compensation. We rely on the government to legislate on standard working hours to set the standard working hours for workers per day, say, for example, 8 hours per day or per week, on the number of days of work per week, that is 5 days per week. Exceeding that, the workers should be given OT pay at a ratio of, say, 1 to 1.5. Standard working hours legislation will protect the rights of workers. When workers are required to work overtime, employers can factor in the cost for overtime pay so that they have a better idea of the costs involved. Some is confusing the idea of standard and maximum working hours. For the latter, it means the maximum number of hours permitted for an employee to work, and exceeding that, the employee will not be allowed to continue to work. Long working hours is affecting workers physically and mentally. They don't have time for further studies. They cannot give full play to their abilities at work. This is not desirable for workers as well as employers. Many workers would like to have a work life as well as a family life. If the government can expeditiously legislate on standard working hours and overtime compensation, workers can have a work-life balance. They will have a stronger sense of belonging to the country, to the company. And according to a survey, over 50% of parents spend less time with their families because of working overtime, and family conflicts have to do with lack of communication with their children, resulting in a drop in the academic result and conduct of the children. Standard working hours will help enhance efficiency and help workers look after their families, and employers also stand to benefit. According to the ILO, working hours for Hong Kong workers are far beyond the standard. According to the CNSD survey, we work 47 hours per week in 2011, above the 40 hours recommended by the ILO. And the Swiss Bank in 2012 released a report, and in it is said that a person in Hong Kong worked 2,296 hours per year. We rank number 5 out of the 72 countries polled. And we see in Macau and in Taiwan, they have legislated on standard working hours. And on the mainland, there was a paper on the requirement of standard working hours released on the 25th of March 1995 by the State Council, applying to workers in all state or private enterprises. Why, or foreign enterprises set up in China, why is it that it doesn't apply to us? Is it that the two systems should go above one country? Has it to do with the business sector's effort? We understand that they are opposing strongly to standard working hours. Setting standard working hours would undermine our hardworking workers in trying to get more, and it will be difficult to calculate working hours and pay. However, even after setting standard working hours, workers can still choose to work overtime. The only difference is that employers will be required to pay them for the overtime work. So this is really for hardworking workers to get more by working more. In fact, this won't impose a greater burden on business costs. For practitioners requiring to work at irregular hours with flexible arrangement like those in the film and TV industry, and accountants, we can have separate arrangements for them, and this is also the practice in many countries. Now, recently, the committee is proposing the idea, of contract working hours. This is against the concept of standard working hours. This is an effort to draw an end to the advocacy of standard working hours by stipulating overtime pay and working hours in contracts. It seems to be protecting employees' rights, but in fact it doesn't, because employees do not have bargaining power when it comes to work, and the decision-making lies with employers, not employees. Employees do not have the choice to choose a fair contract. And in the election manifesto, the CE promised that we should discuss standard working hours.
Mr. Alan Leung, this is in C.Y. Leung's manifesto, and I quote, "I'll follow up the study on standard working hours. A dedicated committee comprising representatives from the employer, the employers, employees, these social organizations, and academia would conduct studies to look into the coverage of standard working hours, to look into the arrangements on standard working hours of employees." Well, this savior of the grassroots and the nemesis of hegemonic powers, where is he now? So we cannot accept this for the time being. We cannot pocket anything first. If you allow the alliance between the powerful and the rich to continue, if you cannot take away the alliance that wield all the powers, then we cannot change the status quo. Well, when C.Y. Leung runs for re-election, he has to obtain support from the 1,200 members of the EC. But if we accept the constitutional reform package, according to the August 31st decision of NPCSC, the election committee will become the nominating committee. And if the nominating committee doesn't agree, Mr. C.Y. Leung's name will not appear on the ballot paper. So these nominating committee members can stop people from running as a candidate. Actually, minimum wage and standard working hours are two sides of the same coin. If you only have minimum wage, then employees will be forced by the employer to do voluntary work because there's no maximum working hours, and it's useless to have just minimum wage. The logic is straightforward and easy to understand. Presidents, many members have mentioned this point. The Standard Working Hours Committee earlier proposed to enact legislation. There's a consensus, and they agree that this should not be across the board in relation to the level of working hours. But then they want to have contractual working hours and also to set out relevant arrangements for overtime work. Well, this sounds familiar, President. When Mr. Donald Tsang was the CE, when we discussed the minimum wage, he postponed, he dragged his feet by having a voluntary campaign of wage protection. And employers were asked to participate on a voluntary basis. It failed comprehensively, and then there was a delay of 2 years. The employer and the employee are in a very different bargaining position on both ends of the spectrum. If the employer asks you to stay behind for 3 hours and work, and if the employee say, I have worked my best, I have to return home to take care of my children, I have to cook dinner, and I also have to attend an evening course for training. The employer will just say that, so you won't do it? Well, I'll hire another one. Since they are in such a different power positions, does the Secretary for Labor and Welfare think that this can be addressed? This problem of asking employees to do voluntary work without pay can be addressed through contractual working hours? If you say so, the people would just laugh. I think this is just like the wage protection campaign. The purpose of advocating contractual working hours is just to delay things. Maybe it's one of the ploys of C.Y. Leung to seek support from the 1,200 members of the election committee. When we propose minimum wage, the vested interest, the business sector said similar things. It was said that things would be very terrible if we had minimum wage. Operating costs would rise, leading to the collapse of many businesses, and the employees lose out. They do have no jobs. Now we have minimum wage for a number of years, but we haven't seen such a terrible phenomena. President, on the issue of standard working hours, I would like to restate the position of the Civic Party. We regard that we should have, we regard minimum wage and standard working hours as something we must implement to offer the protection to the employees in Hong Kong. I said the same thing on numerous occasions. We hope that within this term of the Council, the government can introduce a bill on standard working hours so that the disadvantaged employees will be given some protection. Mr. Chang Kim-po, we have introduced minimum wage for a number of years. It has been working well. Wages are being protected, and the community as a whole stands to benefit. Many people think that standard working hours and minimum wage are a pair of twins. We have minimum wage, and standard working hours will certainly come to pass. I know that the business sector have many real worries. Standard working hours will inevitably affect the business environment. We have to understand that this is the global trend, and we have to accept it as such. Instead of having worries, why don't we participate in the discussion so that we can balance the interests of different parties and come up with win-win solutions? As we know that working hours in Hong Kong is very long. According to the C&S Department surveys, on average, every week, the median working hours is 45.3 hours, and set for 720,000 workers is over 50 hours, and 80,000 of them more than 60 hours. Of course, this is not present to these workers, and therefore these workers are not happy. I've moved a motion to introduce a new balance policy of work-life balance. We hope the government would encourage employers to introduce policies that would attach more importance to the balance of work and life. According to some studies, if we can achieve work-life balance, families will be happier, and the employees will be more productive. A lot of grievances are there in the community because people are facing a lot of pressure. So if we can help employees to relieve their work pressure and life pressure, the productivity will be enhanced, and it's positive for enterprises. And that's what I call a win-win solution. President, I'm in favor of the direction of setting standard working hours, but we have to face squarely the worries expressed by the business sector because the cost of standard working hours will be borne by the employers. It's a complicated system, much more complicated than minimum wage. The focus of minimum wage is the setting of the minimum wage rate, but standard working hours have to consider many different factors. For example, the number of working hours, how do you compensate overtime work, and the maximum weekly working hours, as well as relevant provisions in the system, which can be controversial. Should we set it at 44? Should we protect the most vulnerable first? I think we should allow more space for the Standard Working Hours Committee to explore. If such controversy cannot be resolved, there will be a lot of labor disputes. And then chances of having a consensus will be slimmer. Most enterprises in Hong Kong are SMEs. They have limited resources. Such a system may have a big impact on that because they may not be able to cope with changes in the market. The government has a duty to help SMEs in resolving these difficulties by way of subsidy or other means of assistance to help them tie over the difficulties. And different trades may have different characteristics. For the manufacturing sector, it's easier to implement such a system, but not so for transport and other trades. According to experience elsewhere, it should not be an across-the-board system. We have to have regard to the different characteristics, the duties undertaken by different employees, and there should be flexibility so that employers of some trades can deal with working hours flexibly. I think we should proceed with caution and consider all relevant factors. The Standard Working Hours Committee have agreed on 3 principles. First, legislating on standard working hours, and also the contract should stipulate the working hours, and also we should protect disadvantaged, low-pay workers first. The committee would like to conduct more studies and will submit a report as scheduled next year to the government. We hope all parties would work hard on this. This is a far-reaching. This will carry far-reaching implications. We spend all the time necessary to study the issues and come up with sound and effective solutions. And I hope that the business sector will support this.
Mr. Chen Chi-chuen. Thank you, Mr. President. Recently, we've heard the speeches of many representatives of the business sector. They oppose standard working hours. They have great concerns and reservations towards standard working hours. We've heard their complaints from their hearts. It's difficult to be bosses. I know it's difficult to be a boss. If it is an SME or a micro business, you need to find money to pay your employees. You need to give employment benefits to them. And if your employees are not working hard, you will find it difficult to be a boss. If you cannot continue your business, the only way out is to end the business. Whether an employer can make money is not the result of the employment policy. Now, if you are a small business owner, you better support the enhancement of working benefits, of workers' benefits, because you may have to follow up your business and become a worker again, or an employee again. In 2013, according to the CNS department, the median working hours is 44 hours per week, but many trades and industries have employees work more than 50 hours per week. Say, for the Chinese restaurants and security guards, they work 50 hours or 60 hours per week, far exceeding the 40-hour week recommended by the ILO. More than 70% of the employees don't have overtime pay. Many employees have to work long hours. They have to work overtime. According to the December 2012 published report, more than 650 among the 2.8 million employees, more than 0.65 million had to work overtime, and only half of them had overtime pay or leave in compensation of overtime. The remaining, more than 48%, don't have any compensation for overtime work. This is not the tip of the iceberg. According to London School of Economics, there is a high risk for 67% higher risk of cardiac diseases for long working hours. And because overtime work, family life is affected, and there is little communication with children, and the conduct of students, the conduct of the children, the social skills of the children, and the school performance of children affected. Now, with standard working hours, employees will have better performance, and that will also benefit the employers. Long working hours will affect the next generation, their education, family relationship. That will affect our future labor force. According to the ILO, overtime work will lead to deterioration in productivity. Working for more than 10 hours a day will increase the work injury rate by 40%. The views given by members are similar. For those who support standard working hours, they have quoted the data I have just quoted. Let me refer to a point which has not been mentioned. That's about quality of life. That's about the sexual life of workers. The Dr. Ng of a group which study sexology said that the standard working hours is very important to sexual well-being of workers. People lack rest because of long working hours. Their health condition is not good. Since if they think that after long hours of work, if they engage in sexual intercourse, that will affect their health. So the sex life of couples affected, and that may lead to divorces. According to the Durex survey in 2014, only 29% of Hong Kong people have a satisfied sex life. The Hong Kong people want to compare themselves with Singapore. As for the Singaporeans, the satisfaction of sexual life is 35%. Hong Kong is even lower. What a pity. Now we are well off, yet we have long working hours, and we live in cramped living space, and people therefore have little interest in their sex lives. If you ask C.Y. Leung, then he will say it's a problem of land supply. Now, if you live in a subdivided unit, you really don't want to have sex because that may disturb your own children. And today is about working hours. That is very important to sex life. Chinese may not want to raise this point and may be shy to raise this point. But if I'm the CE, I run for the CE, then I will use this as the platform. If it's about having children, raising a family, that's also related to sex life. If we want to liberate women to work in the labor market, women want to be a good mother, they want to be a good employee. They cannot have both of it. Finally, they decided not to have children, and that leads to the decline in fertility rate in Hong Kong. The reason is that they don't have time for sex, and they don't want to. They even can't give birth to children because there is no sex life. As for the low-income people, sex life is the cheapest entertainment, but they don't have the time because of long working hours. Legislation on standard working hours will be helpful. Mr. Tommy Chow. Mr. President, In January, it was reported that the consultancy study commissioned by the committee, Standard Working Hours Committee, found that 73% of the respondents work overtime for more than 5 hours per week, and they are unremunerated. Some have said that overtime work in the catering industry was very serious. Yet the report has yet to be published. They said that they quoted such a report. I have doubts about the accuracy of the report. I asked the authority to provide the whole questionnaire, the full set of questionnaires, but the administration said that they were unable to provide that because the study is yet to be completed. Now, many companies do not spell out working hours in the contract. How can people say that they work overtime? In the catering industry, although they are not in a contract, they do have a log. They do have working hour logs. The survey is on the respondents whether they have overtime work in the past 7 days before the survey. Have they worked overtime? Even if there is no compensation for the previous 7 days, it doesn't mean that there is no compensation for overtime work. Now, after the period of overtime work, the employees may be compensated with additional leave. Let's have the catering industry an example. During there is the peak season and there is the low season. During the low season, there will be compensation in terms of additional leave. Say, for example, in June, it is in May, in June, it is low season. But in fact, the low season begins in April. During the summer holidays, it may be a low season. We can allow the employees to take more leave so that they can stay at home and spend more time with their families. It's not just the catering industry. Other industries and trades also have peaks and troughs. Now, if there is a big project, you may have to work overnight, say lawyers, accountants, IT professionals, also have to work long hours during the peaks, and working hours their long working hours may be longer than the catering industry. There is no single set of legislation that's suitable for Hong Kong's different trades and industries. At the end of the day, that will only adversely affect the employees. The administration may be aware of the problem. Last week, the administration said that the administration is focusing on regulating employees making less than $15,000. It is claimed that it would protect the low-income earners. Well, I dare not say it is doing bad things with a good intention. In fact, you don't have a good intention. With regard to minimum wage, you say it is to protect low-income earners, but you're just making things worse. If you look at minimum wage, low-skill low-skill workers and old workers do not get any job. An old man used a fake identity document to get himself employed. Now, because of minimum wage, the employers will only employ those who are productive, who, with the minimum wage, cost has increased. In comparison with minimum wage, the adverse impact of standard working hours will be many times greater. With legislation, it will only force employers to give overtime pay to the employees. There will be no shortening of working hours that will escalate the costs. Mr. Chan referred to Singapore. Singapore has minimum wage. Singapore has standard working hours, but Singapore has imported workers. Now, the Singapore drivers speak Putonghua, but in Hong Kong we don't have drivers speaking Putonghua. Recently, the labor unions have many demands. They ask for public holidays instead of statutory holidays. The small restaurants are having a lot of problems dealing with the rising welfare demands. The adverse impacts of minimum wage will lead to simplification procedures, mechanization. It's fortunate that the economy is good and there is a rising demand for labor, and therefore the adverse impacts have been reduced. But regulating working hours will only lead to greater adverse impacts. The market will become more inflexible. It will change the mode of operation. Labor representatives said that Singapore has standard working hours already commented on that. They also have imported labor. We don't have natural resources. We only have harbour. In the past 50 years, we rely on ample supply of labor force and flexible labor market to boost our economy. Competitiveness of Hong Kong is declining. We should wake up to this, and introduction of more restrictions will reduce the adjustment of labor market. We will not have competitiveness. Investors will be deterred. I urge the administration to stop and should not follow overseas countries to introduce unnecessary regulation to the labor market. You should not just want to get votes and recognition to do that.
Mr. Michael Tian.